turn it on. So yeah, hi everyone. We are just waiting for a couple of minutes. I can see already many people. We are very curious about this, as you know. So there is like very huge interest about the return of the state. Yeah, one more minute and then we start. Also, people can join. We will, do this very, very slowly. I hope my voice is also acceptable because I'm also like, in the mid-season kind of flu, although not COVID. So Heidi, what do you think?
Yeah, I think we can make a start. It's already recording, so just whenever you're ready, Lorena.
All right. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our monthly International Development and Innovation Seminar Series here at the Open University, although online. My name is Lorena Lombardozzi, and I'm a senior lecturer in economics here at the Open University. And today we are super excited to have with us today Ilias Alami, who is currently a Marie Curie Fellow at the Department of Social and Economic Geography at Uppsala University. Before that, he was working as a research fellow at Maastricht University and then in Manchester. So you moved quite a lot. As we all know, I guess, who is joining here today, the current research interests are focusing on state capitalism and legacy of industrialization and reindustrialization. Also with, I think your PhD was also focusing on issue of financialization. So it's been widely published in many geography and non-geography journals. So without making this list, it's like you're getting everybody's like, okay, what is this month's latest publication of Ilias? But yeah, very nice. So today, Ilias will kind of make a synthesis of the wrap up of this recent research on state capitalism. There is an upcoming book that is written with Adam Dixon that he will maybe tell us more about it. And the current title of the title of the presentation is The Specters of State Capitalism. And I just want to give a couple of rules about the housekeeping. So the video is being recorded and will be available for playback on our website. But if people don't want to be featured, they can ask questions in the chat box during the Q&A and ask to remain anonymous. Otherwise, we will, after the presentation, have plenty of time to ask questions to Ilias during the Q&A, and you can just raise your hand with the command on Teams. We'll also thank Professor Susan Newman, who's our head of discipline here today, who joined as a discussant. So after Ilias' presentation, we will have a short commentary from her. And thanks again, Susan, for joining us. And finally, you are automatically muted, but please do not be scared. I mean, we will kind of open the floor later on. And please follow us on Twitter using the, with the handler intdev _ OU. There is also a newsletter registration, and Heidi has put all the details in the chat box. So without further ado, I'll just give the floor to Ilias. I'll put myself on mute and I will turn off my camera. So I will concentrate on your presentation. And thanks again. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lorena, for this introduction, and thanks for the invitation as well to present some of my work today. It's great to be here. Okay, let me share my screen. Yeah, can you guys see the screen and everything?
Not just yet.
Oh.
Sometimes it takes a few seconds.
Okay, let me start again. Oops.
Yeah, great, we can see that now.
Yeah, okay, great.
Wonderful.
Brilliant. Let me share that. Yes, so thanks for having me today. The title of my talk is The Specter of State Capitalism. This is part of some work I've been doing with Adam Dixon at Maastricht University. So let me start by giving you a little bit of background on the talk. What I'm going to present today is basically based on a conceptual and / programmatic paper, which we've recently published in EPA. And this is part of a theme issue called Making Space for the New State Capitalism, which Adam and I are co-editing with Heather Whiteside and Jamie Peck. And this is also part of conceptual material that we'll be using in our forthcoming book, also titled The Specter of State Capitalism. So please, any critical feedback, comments, suggestions are most welcome. Let me start my timer at the same time. Yes. Okay, so I'll give you a bit of context on the talk, and just to describe a little bit what we're interested in when we talk about the state capitalism. So a lot of people recently have been talking about the return of a state, of course, between quote unquote, because return is itself a notion that we have to problematize a little bit. But usually people, when they speak about the return of the state, they talk about the multiplication of sovereign wealth funds over the past 20 years or so. So as of 2020, there were 127 sovereign wealth funds, which are basically state-owned or state-controlled investment funds, so pools of capital. We've seen a six-fold increase since 2000, and the assets under management of those funds also have massively increased from about $1 trillion about 20 years ago to now almost $9 trillion. And this is quite significant because it represents more than hedge funds and private equity firms combined. So we're talking about really a lot of assets here. Now, at the same time as we've seen this multiplication of sovereign wealth funds, we've also seen a remarkable revival of state-owned enterprises, which, mainstream economists and kind of neoliberal thinkers were considering that those state-owned enterprises were a thing of the past. Well, on the contrary, we've seen quite a remarkable revival over the past decade. They have doubled in importance amongst the world's 2,000 largest firms. And the recent IMF report estimates that their assets are now equivalent to $45 trillion, which is almost half of global GDP. So again, we're talking about big figures here. So sovereign wealth funds and state-owned enterprises are now constituting a major force of transnationalizing capital, which means that they're not only operating within borders, but also across borders. And they're very active in terms of cross-border mergers and acquisitions, the cross-listing of shares, international portfolio investment, and foreign direct investment. Now, at the same time, we've also seen a return to fashion of national development and policy banks, which have vastly expanded their loan portfolio and financial capacities in both advanced capitalist economies and in the global south over the past 20 years or so. Thomas Mawa estimates that there's now more than 900 national and development and policy banks worldwide, and they control assets worth $49 trillion. So again, big figures. At the same time as all that, we've also seen a return, again, in inverted quotes, of techno-industrial policy and national development strategies. So, a return of planning. According to a recent, well, not so recent anymore, but a report from UNCTAD, which was published in 2018, the report says, in the decade since the global financial crisis, the number of countries adopting national industrial development strategies has increased dramatically. The rate of adoption of both formal industrial policies and individual policy measures targeted at industrial sectors appears to be at an all-time high. Now, of course, this was pre-pandemic. So what we've seen, in fact, since the pandemic is a consolidation of this trend and perhaps even an expansion of it. And, of course, as I'm sure many of you will be aware of, there's been, at the same time as what I've just described, a multiplication of trade wars, notably between the US and China, but not only, a turn to more aggressive forms of neo-mercantilist and economic nationalist policies, We've also seen central banks becoming increasingly important for the reproduction of global capitalism, deploying various forms of unconventional monetary policy, such as quantitative easing, but also, states delivering massive bailouts to the private sector after the credit crunch of 2008 and in the aftermath of the pandemic, and so on and so forth. So the state really seems to be back in business pretty much everywhere and in very, very visible ways. Now, as I said, this has been quite more pronounced in the post-pandemic context. So this is, for instance, taken from the Financial Times from last year, I think. This again talks about the return of the state, and you can see this kind of threatening figure with those the masked policymakers. And this is taken from a Bloomberg opinion piece fairly recently as well, which is about the coronavirus epidemic reviving an all-powerful state. Now, in the face of all this, both academics and policymakers have been using the rubric or label state capitalism more and more. So in academia, it's been used increasingly across the social sciences, and as well as in business and political commentary to register, again, this more visible role of the state in the economy and society. And this is not something that is only, observable in the global south or in emerging economies, but it's really across the income spectrum. It's across global north, global south lines, and so on and so forth. So this is, just an example of a research report, which was written by Deutsche Bank. And, they also use the term state capitalism, and they asked the question, are we on our way to state capitalism? Of course, in their mouth, this is actually a pejorative term, and I'm happy to say a bit more about this in a moment. But the point here is that although, people in both academic and policymaking circles are using more and more the notion of state capitalism, the nature and implications of the phenomenon continue to be the object of intense debates. So what do we mean by state capitalism? And by we, I mean Adam, Dixon, and myself in our work and our engagement with this literature. So first, let me note that state capitalism has been used to refer to an incredibly diverse array of political and institutional forms. I've mentioned some of them already, but we can add here that state capitalism has been used in the literature to refer to models of post-developmentalism, models of post-neoliberalism, capitalisms in emerging economies such as China, Russia, Turkey, and so on, the renewal of industrial and neo-mercantilist policies, and many more. So the thing I'll say about this is that for us, it's quite unclear why any of these things, if taken individually, would actually deserve the moniker state capitalism. And there's a few reasons for that. The first one is that overall, when you look at the literature, you see that state capitalism often lacks analytical purchase. So people tend to use it, but rarely define it precisely what it means, and the validity or the analytical validity of the concept. The other reason is that there's in fact already rigorous terms and bundles of concepts which have been specifically developed to study these various political and institutional forms. So, if you study the developmental state, well, there's a bunch of concepts that we already have to talk about this. Same for industrial policy, same for trade wars, same for neoliberalism, and so on and so forth. So the question really is, why calling those things state capitalism? What does it bring to the table to call those things state capitalism? And often, again, this is really not clear when you look at the literature. There's a lot of papers or books which are written about, say, sovereign wealth funds or state enterprises, and the word state capitalism would just be thrown out there without explicitly saying what does it bring to the table. So we try to take a different approach to that. Our argument is that the added value of the category state capitalism is precisely that it calls for an understanding of the recent upward trajectory in these various political and institutional forms together and in relation to each other in a co-constitutive movement. So what we find interesting about state capitalism is that it is a concept that allows us thinking about the rise of sovereign wealth funds, of state enterprises, of techno-industrial policy, all of this together and in relation to each other. And this we find quite useful. In other words, what we propose is that state capitalism can be construed as a flexible means of problematizing the aggregate expansion of the state's role as promoter, supervisor, and owner of capital across the world capitalist economy. And this is characterized by, on the one hand, the multiplication of state capital hybrids, such as the one that I described earlier, sovereign wealth funds, state enterprises, policy and development banks. And on the other hand, what we call the development of more muscular or more aggressive forms of statism, including industrial policy, spatial development strategies, and economic nationalism. So again, state capitalism for us is a means of kind of critically interrogating this aggregate expansion and this co-constitutive expansion of both state capital hybrids and muscular forms of statism. So this is the kind of conceptual contribution that we, or say epistemological contribution that we make to the literature. Now, what we add also is that this kind of reframes a little bit the question about state capitalism. We're less concerned about trying to identify the specific institutional contours of state capitalism, and we're more concerned about the following questions. Why does state capitalism ascend? How does it ascend? Why now? With what implications? And how to explain its institutional diversity? So if you look at the literature again, the main type of approach that you see is a kind of perspective which is inspired by the varieties of capitalism literature and historical institutionalism. And so in this tradition, state capitalism is conceived as a national, or at best a regional, variety of capitalism, which is often seen as coming from China or other large emerging economies like India, Brazil, South Korea, Indonesia, and so on. And according to this perspective, this emerging variety, national variety of capitalism is increasingly rivaling the more conventional neoliberal market economies which prevail in the West. And this is also transforming the liberal world order. Now, we think that this is, this points to interesting aspects of what is currently happening, but it's also missing some important bits, at least in our view. So we see a few problems with those types of approaches and argument. First, we think that there's a problem in terms of scale. So according to this definition that, as I said, is quite common and even dominant in the literature, we see that state capitalism is conceived as being primarily contained within national social formations. And from there, it can expand by transnationalizing, for instance, by exporting capital, or by exporting specific development models, and so on and so forth. But in the first place, at an ontological level, state capitalism is conceived as being contained within national borders and as being the product of domestic forces. Now, we think that's a problem because if you recall what I just described with those various data points and empirical data points, state capitalism, at least in its current form, is really a global thing. So we do think that it's perhaps unsatisfying to conceive of state capitalism as something that is primarily contained at the national level, which is a form of methodological nationalism. The other problem with those types of approaches is that they have difficulties to account for connections between various repertoires of state intervention. So as I argued earlier, what we find quite interesting about state capitalism is precisely this notion that we should reflect about the various forms of connections that exist between, say, the rise of state enterprises, new forms of industrial policy, the rise of new forms of planning, and so on and so forth. And so if you conceive of state capitalism as being contained within national formations, it's a little bit difficult to draw connections with other forms of state enterprises and so on, which are happening in other spaces of the global economy. And we actually think that what matters crucially to understand the current rise of state capitalism, as I'll explain in a moment, is precisely about those relations and those connections and forms of interdependence between various repertoires of state intervention. Now, another problem with this type of narrative is that it is fundamentally underpinned by a narrative of a clash between rival political and economic models. So typically, there's a lot of talk about a Chinese version of state capitalism, being more and more powerful and increasingly competing with say, a free market version of Western-based capitalism. And this is what is moving the whole thing, basically. Well, we do think that this is also quite limited as an explanation because it fails to also understand or to grasp the reconfiguration of state power within the political economies, which are often considered extremely neoliberalized or free market oriented, and so on and so forth. And finally, another problem, which is very significant in our view, and most of my talk today will be about this, is that there is little reflection in those type of approaches about the historical development of global capitalism, such as planetary mutations in the spheres of production, circulation, and distribution of value, and how those perhaps could explain why we have seen a transformation in the role of the state, which has rendered it more visible across the world economy. So basically, our conceptual contribution is to try to address all of those problems and limitations. So let me unpack a little bit more how we do that. Well, first, we propose that rather than seeing, rather than interpreting state capitalism as the rise of a new state-led national model of capitalism, which allegedly competes with and alongside free market capitalism, we conceive of state capitalism as a process of state restructuring. Now, what it means is that for us, state capitalism is not some sort of anomaly or a deviance from, say, a more normal liberal market-based capitalism, but we conceive of state capitalism as a particular modality of expression of the capitalist state, including in its liberal form. And I'll explain a little bit what this means later. But for now, the point is that by contrast with the literature, which tends to portray state capitalism as something exceptional or abnormal, we conceive of it as an immanent potentiality, which is contained in the form of the capitalist state, as an impulse which is built into its DNA and which can be actualized depending on various socioeconomic conditions. And so the essential question becomes, why is this potentiality of state capitalism currently activated or actualized at the current historical juncture? And this is precisely the question that we try to address in the book that we're finishing up at the moment. Now, to put it a bit more simply, this is essentially about reflecting about what it is about the historical development and geographical remaking of global capitalism, which is underpinning state capitalist impulses. Right. So what is it what is it about the global economy which is pushing states to be more present in the economy and society and in transforming the ways in which they intervene? And so in order to address these questions, we drew attention to two secular capitalist transformations, which I'll walk you through now. The first one is the automation, robotization, and digitalization of the labor process. So this, appears quite disconnected from what I've been talking about right now. But in fact, in our view, in order to understand this transformation role of the state, we need to look at the labor process and the various transformations that it has experienced. And so when you look at the labor process about the past 20 years or so, this process of automation, robotization, and digitalization has enabled a deepening of the new international division of labor, especially since the early 2000s. Now, this has been characterized by, East Asian late industrializing countries like South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and so on, to experience a process of industrial upgrading, which in turn led to the concentration and the relocation of low-skilled labor-intensive manufacturing activities in China and Southeast Asia, in countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, and so on, and to pockets of industrialization in some other parts, in some parts of Central America, Northern Mexico, Central and Eastern Europe, and North Africa. So what we've seen as a result of this process is that there's been the emergence of more complex constellations of old and new divisions of labor. So recall that, by old division of labor, this referred to the fact that at least until the 1950s, the world economy was divided between core and peripheries. Core economies focusing on manufacturing goods, and peripheral economies focusing on exporting primary commodities. Now, with the first wave of the new international division of labor, which started in the 60s and 70s, we've seen transnational corporations offshoring to developing economies, a number of manufacturing activities like textile, clothing, shoemaking, simple consumer electronics, and so on. And this has led to this unfolding of the beginning of the new international division of labor. Now, the process that I've just described, with this automation, robotization, and digitalization of industry, has pushed and further developed this process of new division of labor. However, this doesn't mean that the old division of labor was entirely displaced, because in fact, this process of industrialization in East Asia and the associated processes of urbanization and proletarianization have have created a lot of demand for foodstuff, for raw materials, for mining commodities, for agricultural commodities, and so on. And so resource-rich economies have actually benefited from a commodity boom. They've exported a lot of resources to those spaces of the world economy, and this has created a process of reprimarization and premature deindustrialization in those economies. And so we've not seen the new division of labor completely displacing the old one. We've seen the emergence and consolidation of both old and new divisions of labor. Now, all of this to say is that those processes have trigger the emergence of a new global pattern of extraction, production, and consumption, characterized by an eastward shift in the center of gravity of the global economy from the North Atlantic to the Pacific Rim. So a major rebalancing of the global economy. And this is quite significant because since at least the long 16th century in the birth of capitalism, the North Atlantic was really what was at the core, at least geographically. And now there's this kind of radical rebalancing eastward. Now, as I'll explain in a moment, this has required a massive transformation in the ways states intervene in order to facilitate and mediate politically this process of geographical rebalancing. But for now, let me talk about this second global transformation that we think is important to understand the rise of state capitalism. And this is the worsening of the long downturn, which is an expression coined by Robert Brenner in the 2000s and 2010s, which means that the generalized crisis of overaccumulation, which started in the 70s, has actually worsened and become more visible in the 2000s and 2010s. Now, this has manifested as a chronic situation of industrial overcapacity, saturation in global product markets, an intensification of international competition for industrial firms, and so on and so forth. And you can see this across quite a wide diversity of sectors, such as steel, aluminum, shipbuilding, consumer electronics, even semiconductors, and so on and so forth. And so what this meant, or an implication of this, is that we've seen low manufacturing output growth, low labor productivity gains, and a slow pace of investment. And again, we've seen this more and more since the aftermath of the global financial crisis of 2008 and throughout the 2010s. And mainstream economists have also started to grapple with this, and they basically refer to this as secular stagnation. Now, the reason this is important here is that capitalist firms have reacted in a few different ways in reaction to that, but I'd like to emphasize two here. The first one is that there's been a massive round of concentration and centralization of capital. And this is basically because firms, when facing this context of kind of intensified international competition, saturation in product markets, overcapacity, overproduction, and so on, as a means to grow in this context, they've started buying each other off more and more. So instead of investing in production in this kind of morose, stagnating economic context, it's easier to grow and maintain profitability rates by acquiring competitors, mostly via mergers and acquisitions. So this has been the first strategy. And the second one, of course, is the extension of speculative and financial activities, where, so to speak, capital has fled the sphere of production and sought refuge in the sphere of finance and speculative financial activities and so on, which is a story I'm sure you'll be familiar with. And there's much literature on financialization and all that. Now, our argument is therefore the following. If you look at what has happened to the labor process and the production of value on the world scale over the past 20 years or so, we've seen on the one hand, this process of automation and robotization and digitalization of large-scale industry, which has manifested geographically as the deepening of the new international division of labor and new global patterns of extraction, production, and consumption. And on the other hand, there's the second important transformation in global capitalism, which is about secular stagnation, overproduction, and so on. And the argument we're making in the book is that in order to understand the contemporary rise of state capitalism, we need to look at how the state has been mediating those two transformations. It's about how states have developed new ways of intervening in the economy in order to both facilitate those transformations that I described, and how they have their crisis tendencies as well, and how they have transformed themselves in the process. In other words, how they have restructured themselves. And what we do in the book is that we go through all of those transformations, and we basically identify what we call 4 state capitalist impulses, which are here. We identify a productivist state capitalist impulse, an absorptive state capitalist impulse, a stabilizing one, and a disciplinary one. And the argument again is that state capitalism is not the kind of monolithic phenomenon, but can actually be split into all of those 4 tendencies. And what we do in the book is that we carefully document them and provide a lot of examples and case studies for each of those. Now, of course, I won't have time to do this now, but I'll still go through all of those state capitalist impulses briefly and give you a few key trends and tendencies. So what do we mean by the productivist state capitalist impulse? Well, by this, we refer to how states have developed new ways to directly intervene in production arrangements and in the competitive dynamics of productive capital. Now, this has been observed in a variety of ways. First, states have developed new forms of intervention and modalities of government-business cooperation in order to ensure the favorable participation of their firms in global value chains. So if you look at this kind of new constellation of all the new division of labor that I mentioned earlier, of course, the organizational form that this has taken is the form of the global value chain or the form of the global production network. And states have had to develop new ways to facilitate the unfolding of those chains, as well as the favorable participation of their firms in those value chains. So as part of this process, we've seen a reconfiguration of industrial and innovation policy, including the increasing use of policy banks, the creation of national champions, and other forms of strategic support to industry to make sure that firms can coordinate and integrate the various stages of production along global value chains. So as we know, this is quite important because coordinating and integrating those various stages of production is precisely the means through which firms can capture value and concentrate market power. And at the same time, in resource-rich developing economies, we've seen vast trends from primary commodity exports as part of the commodity boom that I mentioned earlier, which provided the material basis to reincorporate state enterprises in the design of new development strategies. Now, states have been doing this in countries like Brazil, Indonesia, Senegal, Mozambique, and so on. And the reason for this is that states have been trying to capture, of course, some of the rents coming from those primary commodity exports to take advantage of the commodity boom, but also to increasingly use state enterprises as a means to channel some of those rents to other productive sectors as a means to catalyze structural transformation and economic diversification in their economies. So this is, what we call the productive state capitalist impulse. So as part of this, states have also used state enterprises, policy banks, and sovereign wealth funds as a means to provide capital in the form of money to different segments of their economies. And this is primarily because with repeated financial crises, it's become apparent that relying on financial markets for the funding of firms has proven quite problematic. And so states have stepped in basically to provide finance for structural change and economic diversification via the use of development banks, policy banks, state enterprises, and so on and so forth. So this is what we call the productivist state capitalist impulse. Now we also
Yes, 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Let me move to the second state capitalist impulse, the absorptive one. To understand the state capitalist impulse, we need to look at how the reorganization of global production that I mentioned earlier has led to the formation of a highly uneven planetary distribution of surpluses, which has provided the material basis for an enlargement of the state role as owner of capital. So, it basically, to kind of unpack this a little bit, we've seen the consolidation of export-oriented models in East Asian economies and the reprimarization of many developing economies in Latin America and Africa. This has led to the accumulation of vast amount of surpluses, from commodity export revenues to balance of payment surpluses, and the buildup of a very large amount of foreign exchange reserves. And those have provided funding sources for the multiplication of sovereign wealth funds and for a massive expansion of the assets that they control globally. And so basically states have used sovereign wealth funds, state enterprises, and state asset management companies as a means to absorb and recycle those surpluses by putting them into motion as financial capital. So typically, some of the commodity export revenues would be put into a sovereign wealth fund, which then would be used to invest those resources in, say, financial markets or real estate markets in London or in advanced manufacturing in Western Europe. So this is what we call the absorptive state capitalist impulse. The third one is the stabilizing state capitalist impulse. Now, the argument that we make here is that states have produced new forms of intervening in order to retain sovereignty and to secure political legitimacy in the face of the crises which have resulted from the transformations that I described earlier, especially this kind of rise of speculative finance. So just to unpack this a little bit, states have been using more and more sovereign wealth funds, state enterprises, capital controls, and other forms of intervention in foreign exchange markets as a means to mitigate financial volatility and to facilitate macroeconomic management in the context of acute financial instability. Development banks have also been used as counter-cyclical tools to offset private credit crunches. So for instance, when the 2008 global financial crisis triggered the private credit crunch, many states stepped in with their development banks in order to continue the flow of credit going. And of course, central banks have also played a more and more important role in this context, in terms of propping up the value of financial assets with quantitative easing, but also enhancing their roles as lenders and market makers of last resort, as Daniela Gabor has shown in her recent work, and now increasingly as fiscal actors in the post-COVID-19 context, where central banks are now actually buying government debt and therefore are playing a fiscal role. And finally, we've witnessed what we call a disciplinary state capitalist impulse. And by this, we refer to the fact that automation and the labor-saving technologies that I mentioned earlier, combined with the worsening economic stagnation, have actually depressed the global demand for labor. And this is because, typically in the context of a dynamically growing economy, you have job destruction as part of labor productivity, technology enhancements. But you also have job creation because there's new markets being created, new products being created, investment, and so on and so forth. But in a stagnating economy, you have much less of the second part of this equation. And as a result, what we've seen is that the global demand for labor has decreased quite significantly. And an implication of that is, of course, that we've seen a multiplication of relative surplus populations. In other words, populations considered surplus relative to the needs of capital for formal wage labor, which means that the system as a whole is less and less able to integrate people as wage workers. And this has created a problem for states in the sense that they have sought to discipline those relative surplus populations. And this is why we've seen a turn to more increasingly coercive and repressive forms of rule, from aggressive border militarization, the development of systems of mass surveillance and incarceration, the criminalization and brutal repression of social movements, to the suspension of the rule of law and civil liberties. Now, again, this is not something that is specific to the economies that are usually considered illiberal, like Hungary, or Serbia or China, and so on and so forth. This is also, of course, within the so-called liberal heartlands. And France under Macron and before is a clear example of that, where like the naked use of state power was usually reserved to, say, racialized populations or undocumented migrants and so on. But now this naked use of state power has actually been ramped up across segments of society, and this has been clear with the Gilets jaunes crisis, where there's been a massive criminalization and brutal repression of the insurrection. Now, the argument here is that with those dynamics in global capitalism consolidating, there's been an increasing difficulty for the capitalist state to sustain its liberal form. And there's been recently a number of concepts which have been proposed to grasp this, with notions of global police state, planetary illiberalism, authoritarian illiberalism, and so on and so forth. So again, to a quick recap, because yeah, that was a little intense. What I've argued so far is that there's been two fundamental transformations in global capitalism over the past 20 years. On the one hand, automation, robotization, digitalization of large-scale industry, leading to the consolidation of a new international division of labor. And on the other, this concept of economic stagnation. And in order to understand state capitalism, we need to look at how the state has facilitated and mediated the political consequences of those transformations. And this has led to four state capitalist impulses. Now, of course, those four state capitalist impulses have not happened uniformly across states in the world economy, and they have also not happened independently from each other. Hence, the second part of our argument, which is that understanding the rise of contemporary state capitalism also requires examining the various forms of interdependence and combination between new repertoires of state intervention, notably mechanisms of competitive emulation. So let me give you a few concrete examples to illustrate this. Let's take the example of sovereign and state-sponsored investment funds. So I've talked a lot about this already. I've made the argument that in order to understand the general multiplication of those funds since the early 2000s, we need to look at how they are rooted in the global transformations discussed earlier and their uneven geographical manifestations. But the argument that I'm making here is that we also need to look at mechanisms of policy emulation between states. So for instance, if you look at Kazakhstan's Samruk-Kazyna, which is Kazakhstan's sovereign investment fund, it's been modeled on the experience of sovereign wealth funds which had been previously developed elsewhere, such as the Singaporean and the Malaysian investment funds. Similarly, we've seen recently an expansion of East Asian and Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds, with many states across the developing world basically copying some of these forms of interventions, including across the African continent, with Senegal, Morocco, Egypt, and so on and so forth, creating their own state-sponsored investment funds. I've recently done some research, some fieldwork in Senegal and Kenya, and we did some interviews with policymakers who were directly involved in the creation of those funds, and they explained to us how they really try to copy some forms of policy making and some state investment vehicles which have been first created in Southeast Asia and then in the Middle East, and also looking at other funds in Africa. Another example is that of techno-industrial policy. If you look, for instance, at the ongoing project in the EU to spur the creation of European digital champions, this is a direct response to the successes of China and the US in nurturing the activities of their own digital champions. And this has been very neatly encapsulated by a recent statement by Margaret Vestager, who's the Executive Vice President of the European Commission. And she declared, "One thing that we could learn from China is to make a strategy and stick to it." Similarly, if you look at calls for a renewed industrial policy in the US, those have been a direct response to initiatives such as the Made in China 2025 and other modalities of industrial policy in China. So again, the argument here is that those new forms of techno-industrial policy are rooted in the development of the technological and labor productivity frontier, but also in direct competitive relations between states and the kind of mimetic behavior that you can observe and competitive emulation. Finally, The example of development finance and infrastructure development is also striking from the perspective of this competitive emulation. If you look at the recently announced Build Back Better World, which is an initiative conceived by the G7 to counter the influence, so to basically fund and construct developing infrastructure projects in the developing world as a means to specifically counter the influence of China's extensive Belt and Road Initiative. Similarly, the US has created what is effectively a national development bank. This is the US International Development Finance Corporation, and again has been designed to compete more effectively with China's Belt and Road Initiative by co-funding infrastructure projects in developing countries. Similarly, again, the EU's Global Gateway, announced just a couple of months ago, aims to mobilize up to 300 billion in investments between 2021 and 2027 to also finance and build joint infrastructure projects. So you can see how there's clearly a dynamic of competitive emulation between various states as part of this new state capitalism. And the UK as well has kind of rebranded its Commonwealth Development Corporation. It's called it British International Investment, and it is also precisely about funding infrastructure projects in developing countries as a means to counter, Chinese influence, but also to compete with the French, with the German, with the Americans, and so forth. Okay, let me conclude and make a few final remarks. So the argument that I've made is that instead of seeing contemporary state capitalism as the rise of a new state-led national model of capitalism, which allegedly competes with free market capitalism, we propose to see state capitalism as a global process of state restructuring. And we locate this process of state restructuring within two secular transformations pertaining to the historical development of global capitalism, the global reorganization of production, and the worsening of economic stagnation. And we focus on the political mediation of these two secular transformations by the states, which has led to 4 state capitalist impulses. And the second part of the argument is that contemporary state capitalism is also shaped by relations of combination and competitive emulation between various forms of state intervention, which span global north and global south lines. Now, this has implications for how we understand the geopolitical repercussions of state capitalism. This is because it is unlikely to lead to patterns of institutional convergence or divergence, which have been central lenses in state capitalism studies and in discussions of changing world order. So if you look, for instance, at the very influential work of Branko Milanovic and Robert Boyer, the famous regulationists, they basically argue or try to understand the future of capitalism as a convergence towards more free markets or towards a more political or state-led capitalism. So they basically, see those transformations through the lens of convergence or divergence towards specific models. Now, we argue that this is probably not what's going to happen. We argue that it's, state capitalism may well beget more state capitalism, but the future of the global political economy will not be one where a model has prevailed over another. Instead, we're more likely to see a sort of polycentric restructuring of the global landscapes of state capitalism, catalyzed by the cumulative unfolding of more muscular state prerogatives across the world capitalist economy. So again, this is not a story of one model, prevailing over the other. And now, the more speculative part of the argument that we develop in the conclusion of the book is that this cumulative unfolding of more muscular state prerogatives has the potential to lead to a deeper transformation in the form of the state and in its relation to capital, which may in turn imprint the future of capitalism with a distinctly new flavor, hence the Specter of State Capitalism, which is the title of the book. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Ilias. That was a very rich presentation. I think we should have studied in advance. But yeah, I mean, as you said, it's very dense. And due to time, maybe Susan might want to touch upon a couple of points just to give time for like Q&A also to participate. But yeah, so I'll just give the floor to Susan.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Ilias. That was a super presentation. And excuse my voice, it is going. I hope people can hear me okay. But I really look forward to reading the book. That was a massive amount to go over, and I'm just very impressed by the clarity with which we were able to deliver this particular story and analysis of contemporary capitalism and the role of the state within that. I also, as you know, you've really built on a lot of really great work that's been done within the sort of Marxist political economy tradition. And I think what's been fantastic here is the way in which you recognise diversity and the diversity of these forms in which these phenomena take as integrated and interrelated within its totality, which is precisely, I think, the job that, you know, historical materialist analysis needs to seeks to do. So I really welcome this, and especially understanding the changing role of the state in relation to capitalist restructuring. I think work is very much focusing on this latest stage of capitalist restructuring, which we can probably date from around the time of the rise of financialization, if we want to use that term, related to the long run decline in profitability. So this is really useful, and I think it reminds me very much. I mean, we know that many Marxist scholars have actually never ever saw the state as having gone away, and that very much it was very clear that even, you know, mainstream political economists want to see the state and the political and economic powers institutionally separated. We know as historical materialists that has never been the case, and even with neoliberalism, it would be wrong to see it as withdrawal of the state, but rather the restructuring of the state and its role in relation to global capitalist restructuring. And I think this is what you've done very, you know, extremely impressively for this latest period. I think it also reminds me of the systems accumulation approach, which I know you will know of from as it was applied to the mineral energy complex in South Africa. And I think there's a couple of things to say. I mean, maybe just go back a little bit. I think, you know, the hybrid forms of state capital that you mentioned here makes it impossible to understand economic and political powers being separate. But I think in another paper you look very much at saying we're not looking at just the role of the state in the way in which it intervenes or acts, but why the state interacts and intervenes in the way that it does. You know, what lies behind those interests. And I think what I learned a lot from systems of accumulation approach is to understand those the kind of the antagonism and contradictions between political and economic power, and in relation to the historical development of South African industrial development. You know, we know with the nationalist governments of the 1950s and 60s, it was very much about about eroding that separation between political and economic power and uniting those in order to build the Afrikaner kind of movement and economic basis, right? So political economic basis. So I guess the question I had there was really like that you know, just to understand a bit better from your work what these interrelations between political and economic power and their contradictions manifest in their institutional forms. The second thing I want, you know, that I think very clearly from your presentation, you don't fall into the trap. Now, you won't necessarily have to fall into the trap of the developmental state capital dichotomy. But I'm not 100, and you can't because you've shown these hybrid forms, right? So, but I would like you to tell us a little bit more about how your approach is going to be different and distinct from that, and how we, you know, in a way, I think what I was hoping to see a bit more of in your presentation, some of the work is an actual, not only a theory of the role of the state and the way in which it's acted, but the role of the state itself as an entity that comes out of social formations. So that leads me to the next question, which is a question of class. So you do mention, you know, you do discuss the role of labour in the new international division of labour and what that has meant, and the sort of increasing repression of labour. We see it everywhere. But at the same time, we also see much more labour activity over the last couple of decades. We see a lot more organisation, a lot more class struggle, at the same time as increasing polarisation. You know, and political polarisation. So I just wanted to, you know, just the agency of society, really, social actors, social movements. Where are we and how do we relate to the state? And is there something different about state-society relations under this new configuration? And that those, I hope that was somewhat clear enough but I've got other things I want to ask. I'd like to hear what others have to say. I want to hear your answers, so I'm going to stop there. Also, you'll stop able to hear me soon, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Susan. I think they're very clear questions, and I think, do you think, Ilias, do you want to just reply to Susan, or do you want to collect a couple of more questions and then have a response? What do you prefer?
I think Susan has made already quite a few very interesting points, so perhaps I could maybe briefly react to those, and then I can collect some other questions. Yeah, but thank you so much, Susan. That was really great, and thanks for your kind words. And I think you really put your fingers on some very important things, and perhaps tensions in our argument as well. At least things that we've been trying to grapple with, and we're still trying to grapple with as we are finishing the book. So I'll just comment quickly on some of the points that you made. In terms of the relation between the economic and the political in capitalism, and the antagonism between political forms of power and economic forms of power. I mean, I think this is a great question. And, on the one hand, I'll say that what's indeed interesting about state enterprises and sovereign wealth funds and all of those state capital hybrids is, as you said, they really force us to think about those two forms of power together and in relation to each other, precisely because those are forms of those are organizational forms which embody a political logic and an economic one. Now, we also know that this is simply more obvious in the case of those state capital hybrids, but this is of course more general to capitalism as a whole, where on the one hand, it is necessary to maintain an artificial separation or a neat separation between the political and the economic in capitalism as a means of depoliticizing some of the contradictions of capitalism, which is why the state appears as neutral and separated from the rest of the economy and from the private sphere and civil society and so on and so forth. But I do think that indeed, state capital hybrids are a very interesting epistemic angle from which to think again about this question of the separation of the economic and the political in capitalism, and how this is itself mutating, how the line between the two is being redrawn because of political struggles, between various sections of capital, between various state apparatuses, but also under the impulse of broader social struggles, hence the agency of labor and so on, which I'll come back to in a moment. But this is what I'll say about this notion of the separation between the economic and the political. And I mean, of course, this is also a great occasion to try and rethink a little bit historical materialist state theory, which has done a fantastic job in the past to theorize the reason why those appear separated in capitalism, but is perhaps less good or in need of revising in terms of how, as I said, this separation has to be continuously reproduced in new forms. And so in the case, just to give an example of this, I mean, we're seeing, a very heavy strategic attempt on the part of international institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, and so on, to re-embrace to some extent state ownership. So they're now saying in their reports, that things like sovereign wealth funds, state enterprises can be quite legit forms of intervention for states, as long as they are managed like private entities, as long as they are, kind of managed by former bankers, that there's boards of directors to monitor what they're doing, as long as they're formally separated from finance ministries and central banks, and so on and so forth. And so what we can see here is that on the one hand, they're embracing the fact that states are becoming more active, but they're also working really hard to reconstruct a neat separation between the economic and the political. Okay, I'll stop here for this one. The second question / comment that you had was about the traps of the developmental state theory and so on. I entirely agree with that, and in fact, a lot of this new literature on state capitalism has been quite profoundly inspired by developmental state theory. And this has been both a strength and a weakness in the sense that, notoriously developmental state theory is quite poor at conceptualizing the role of the state in capitalism. And in establishing this very artificial, or taking for granted this artificial separation between the state and the economy, by assuming this kind of embedded autonomy of the state, its relative separation from the economy, and so on. And so we're trying in the book, of course, to avoid this trap. And so, yeah, one of the ways in which we try to do that is by grounding our approach much more in materialist state theory, and in particular the work of Simon Clarke and Werner Bonefeld, who conceive of the state, as they refuse any sort of separation between the state or autonomy between the state and society. The argument is basically that the state is the political form of capitalist social relations. And so that forces us to really kind of ground our understanding of state transformations in an analysis of the transformations of social relations of production in capitalism, which is what we try to do in the book. In relation to the question of class struggle, where's the agency of broader social actors? I entirely agree with that, and unfortunately, this is something that we cannot do too much in the book, perhaps because of the nature of the exercise that we engage in. As you said, it's like broad, painting broad strokes and kind of giving those stylized facts and macroeconomic approaches to what is happening, and we kind of lose a bit of open-endedness and agency of a range of social actors. But we entirely agree that it is a very important question to try and foreground the question of class a bit more prominently in debates about the new state capitalism. We try to do this a little bit with our focus on this, what we call this disciplinary state capitalist impulses, which we really see as an attempt on the part of the state to control and contain those various forms of resistance and organizing that you've described in your comments, Susan. Yes, I'll stop here.
Thank you. I mean, very insightful answers as well to the very important questions that Susan posed. So let me open the floor for Q&A. I don't know if there are already three important set of questions that are sub-questions within it. Is Susan, Florian wants to speak, or should I just read them? I will just read them. So Su Chen she's a postdoctoral at the Redefined Project, which has very good topics. Thanks. Could I ask a question here? Interested in the digital champions in the US and China. What areas of them are in business, education, or more diverse? And what are more specific plans of the EU to combat also in these or other areas? Thanks. And then should I collect the sequence one? It's I think it's Sam asking a question with Florian account. Thanks for the presentation. I have two questions. First one, what do we mean by state capitalism? How and where do you insert political state representative agency in your problematization? And cognate question example, the role of ideology, systemic organization, transnational elite networks. And the second question, it appears that a theory of the state is a small elephant in the room. Here, for example, how can you research enter the story without fuller understanding of state theory? This may help underpin your four impulses. Thank you. So there is a third question, like maybe fourth now, is about you're trying to disentangle from Francis, a PhD here at the University, the state market dichotomy. He thinks that it's still problematic doing it through the concept of state capitalism. But the question is how you relate your argument to the concept of imperialism. Should we stop and then I think it's enough already for you to fund.
Yes, thank you very much for some very interesting questions. Yeah, that's quite a lot indeed. So maybe I'll do my best to answer some of it. So yeah, the first question about digital champions in the US and China. I can't say that I'm an expert in this at all. There's people who are much better qualified than me to speak about this. But I think, yeah, I'll just make a couple points here. The first one is that the digital economy is something that is important at the current historical juncture, not just in terms of it being a sector at the cutting edge of the productivity frontier and technological development, but also because of what it allows to do in terms of the management of global value chains and so on and so forth. So the reason that states are quite keen to have digital champions and to boost digital innovation and so on is not simply to be good at this particular sector, but also to make sure that their domestic firms have the digital capacities to insert themselves favorably in global value chains. And those digital technologies are quite important because they allow to monitor the labor process in a very tight manner by monitoring workflows, inventory fluctuations, even body movements and all of those kind of things. And those are key for the organization, are key things for the organization of production along global value chains at the current moment. So that's the first point. The second point is that the EU, and so yeah, the US and China have champions in those sectors, and the EU is realizing that it has kind of what's the English expression, has missed the boat basically on this move to the digital economy and so on, and so it's kind of caught between the US and its massive champions on the one hand and China on the other. And it's now realizing that perhaps as a way it has constructed itself as a free trade area, preventing some forms of explicit industrial policy, has not allowed for sufficient space for the state to intervene and nurture champions in those sectors. And so I'm not entirely, I don't have like a clear picture to give you in terms of the vast scope of policies which are supposed to be involved in nurturing national champions. But there's quite a few elements here. One is indeed a question of training. One is a question of like funding research and development. One is rendering competition policy more flexible to facilitate the merger and acquisitions of various groups and the acquisitions of technologies, and so on and so forth. So I leave it here for this one. Then, yes, Sam's question, was it? Yeah. I have there are two questions. Yeah, what do we mean by state capitalism? So what we mean by state capitalism is that we propose to use the category as a means of problematizing this kind of process of state restructuring that I discussed. So we don't come up with a definition in terms of a list of institutions that you would need to, or a set of criteria that you need to fill in to be considered state capitalist. It's more of a category in our view that can be deployed to think about or to problematize or to critically interrogate this restructuring of the state that we've been witnessing. So I'm afraid I can't give you a one-liner on this. Well, besides the fact that, and this relates to your second point, is that indeed we need to ground our understanding of state capitalism in materialist state theory. So I didn't have too much time here to speak about this, but this is something we do quite at length in the book. We have a whole chapter dedicated to that. What we try and do is to say, well, starting from the basic heuristics that state capitalism is a social configuration of capitalism where the state is particularly strong or particularly visible, you need to have a theory of the state in the first place to even make the case that this particular example is one where the state is stronger than usual. And we also provide the conceptualization of state capitalism as an impulse, which is contained in the form of the state, as I explained briefly earlier. And so this allows, again, changing the definitional exercise about state capitalism as being something not about trying to identify some specific institutional contours or features of a particular model, and towards reflecting about why in some specific configurations or circumstance states are or may increase dramatically their role as owner, supervisor, and guarantor of capital accumulation. But you're entirely right. It is a small elephant in the room, if not a bigger one. In terms of the role of political state representative agency and so on, I think this is also very important. I think someone like Nathan Sperber has started to do this work of providing a class analysis of the various fractions in the state who embody this double logic of state capitalism, the more economic and the political logic of it. But there's certainly more work to do in that respect. As I said earlier, because of the kind of broad angle approach that we use, we can't focus too much on agency, unfortunately. Okay, and then Francis' question, right?
Yeah, the question about how do you locate your argument into like the imperialism. Yeah.
Yes, that's an interesting question. I mean, there's, I guess it depends, how imperialism is conceived. Is it conceived as a set of practices on the part of certain states? Is it conceived as a broader process of value transfer across the global economy? Is it conceived as a stage in capitalism? So depending on all of those, on the responses that you would give to this question, what is imperialism? Then the concept of state capitalism would fit differently in relation to those. Certainly, if you conceive imperialism as a kind of structural or an embedded feature of the world capitalist economy, which tends to reproduce cores and peripheries, and which tends to channel value from the south to the north, then of course state capitalism is very much related to that in different ways, in the sense that state capitalism or some state capitalist practices and vehicles can be used to facilitate, indeed, imperialist policies or processes. And on the other hand, a major driver of state capitalist impulses, to use the jargon that I used earlier, can be seen as an attempt on the part of subordinated states to counter those tendencies, right? So someone like Andreas Nolke, for instance, has an argument about state capitalism being driven in history by an attempt from countries on the periphery to catch up. And this is how he explains various waves of state capitalism. He speaks about a first wave where the US and Germany have deployed state power as a means to catch up with the UK, for instance, which was at the leading edge of the global capitalist economy at the end of the 19th century. He speaks then about in the kind of classical developmental state period, about countries in East Asia deploying state capitalism or resorting to state capitalist practices as a means to catch up with core economies. And finally, this period being about the BRICS, according to him, using state capitalism as a means to catch up. I think there is some truth to that. But the argument we're trying to make in the book is that the catch-up logic is insufficient to explain the variety of impulses that I've described. And we think that it's more, in fact, perhaps methodologically also and theoretically convincing to focus on transformations in capitalism as a whole, rather than simply the political attempt from one country to catch up on other more advanced ones. I'll stop here.
Yeah. Thanks. It's very, very interesting. I have many questions, but I think we'll have maybe a follow-up after the book has been officially launched. I have a question from Les, who's written in the chat box, and then two questions that people raised hands. I will just read Les' question, which I found very interesting, and it starts with a comment saying your four-part taxonomy of today's state capitalism may be applicable to earlier periods of state capitalism, except perhaps that today's has a clear aims for positioning its national economy in global markets. How do you see history differences and similarities? And then we have three more questions. Are you ready? Drink some water. last round probably. Okay, Jose, another PhD student. I mean, actually, former PhD student now in Sheffield. Thank you. Very interesting presentation. My question: what trends do you see in the way countries are deploying state capitalism in line with your four-part taxonomy? Which type is becoming more common, and what has been driving this shift? So again, like, what has been the similarities? And then maybe Florian and Jeff, I can see that both raised their hands, want to, yeah, just unmute and say, like, ask directly. Yeah. Hi, Florian.
Hi, Florian here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much for an absolutely fascinating talk. My question is, and I think you've already touched on the answer probably a little bit, but you spoke about the impulse that sits within the capitalist state that then becomes actualized as forms of state capitalism, and then the four distinct impulses. So what in your conceptual framework drives the variegation that we observe in the forms of state capitalism across the world, and also in the effectiveness that state capitalisms have? So the impulses defining the aims of the state are one thing, but the extent to which states are actually able to achieve their aims, of course, differ wildly as well. Thank you very much.
Impact, like, it's a buzzword of neoliberal academia. Anyway, sorry. Jeff. Hi, Jeff. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, and thanks for organizing, Lorena, and good to see friend Ilias and hear more of his marvelous work. Just a reaction that I find it really interesting that this discussion of state capitalism and even developmental state before it happens at a time when people are thinking about, if I can crudely put it, positive impulses of the state. And even in your impulses, Ilias, certainly absorption, stabilization, and productive investment are all kind of positive, right? Discipline's an interesting one. I haven't quite thought through that one. But equally, we could pose, to be overly dialectic here, we could pose the exact opposite of those. We could talk about expulsion, destabilization, and exploitation and destruction of value as equally critical functions of the state in the operation of capitalism. And maybe this gets a little bit back to Susan's point that she kicked off with. But this maybe links into, Florian made the point about, where does narrative and ideology fit into this? Why is it that even within critical scholarship, we're now talking about state capitalism because of this shift? Anyway, just a response that you provoked in me as I was listening to your wonderful presentation. My little question, and I'll pose it in a very short way and see if you get why I'm struggling with it, is why are you using secular stagnation? It's a concept that comes with a lot of baggage, and I'll have to read the book to see how you use it more specifically. But in the presentation, at least, you were a bit breezy with your usage of it, which I know is only because you didn't have time in the presentation. But thank you so much.
Thank you. 2-3 solid questions. So for you to conclude your very interesting talk. So we have 10 minutes left.
Okay, I'll do my best to give some brief pointers in response then. But thank you, great questions. And it's nice to see so many familiar names as well. Okay, so Les's question about historical differences and similarities. Have we witnessed other or previous rounds of similar impulses and stuff? I mean, the answer is yes, but and that's because essentially the argument we're making is that yes, those impulses can be activated or deactivated in a way. They are there, and it's all about the development of capitalism and how a certain amount of processes and relations trigger some sort of actualization of those impulses. So from that perspective, of course, you can conceive of an ebb and flow of those impulses, and perhaps even some sort of cyclical dimension to it. Although I think it might be a bit risky to overemphasize this kind of cyclical aspect, because we also make the argument that we shouldn't think about state capitalism as something that is automatic in a bit of a Polanyian way, as kind of a state impulse in response to too much market or in response to too much crisis or and so on and so forth. We really make the argument that essentially what we must do is firmly ground our understanding of those impulses in the development of in the structural development of capitalism. And this is something which leaves no place for repetition, right? Everything is historically and geographically specific, and it has a specific and determinate direction of development. It has cumulative causation, and so on and so forth. So history doesn't repeat itself, basically. So yes, you could see, you know, some perhaps impulses or forms of intervention which have kind of historical resonance or which look like they resemble some stuff from the past, and they may, of course, they may do, and you know, the past always inhabits the present in some ways, including in forms of policymaking, but it's not in the same way at all. Hence, the second part of your question, indeed, now it's more about positioning national economies in global markets because of this new constellations of old and new division of labor, because of the unfolding of global production networks, and so on and so forth. I mean, of course, you know, older policy tools and means of intervening can be revisited and readapted to the new context, but it is a new context nonetheless. But ultimately, this raises the very important question of how to think about state capitalism in relation to time, and that this is something we try to grapple with in the book. But I'll stop here for now. Yes, about the four-part taxonomy, about the impulses, which type is becoming more common? Well, I guess the taxonomy. This is an interesting question. The taxonomy is here to try and stop thinking about state capitalism as this kind of monolithic model that, you know, would be raising or would be replicating in the same way elsewhere and so on. And it is here also to try and make sense of various forms of ways in which states have mediated the secular transformations that I've mentioned earlier. But it's not an argument about one, impulse becoming perhaps more significant than the others. Similarly, it's not an argument about one impulse becoming dominant in one political economy or national formation and another impulse being dominant in other social formations. It's about how several states, like real states, have been implicated in various ways in those impulses, and often in relation to each other. Which leads to the second part of your question, which is what is driving those impulses? As I said, it's kind of those global transformations, but what is driving or what is leading some states to embody some of those impulses and not the others is really the position of those states in the constellations of old and new divisions of labor that I mentioned earlier. So depending on this position and depending on, you know, power struggles across the global economy between more powerful and less powerful states will then be presented with different sets of constraints and opportunities to which then will lead to naturalization or not of of state capitalist impulses, right? So if you're a country which, because of the nature of capitalist development prevailing in your economy, have massive surpluses, then those can be used, you know, you can put those in sovereign wealth funds and you can use those funds to invest in other spaces in the global economy and so on. But that might not be so you have this opportunity in a way. That might not be the case of a country which is positioned differently in the division of labor. So ultimately, at least in our view, institutional diversity and the various combinations of impulses is due, of course, this is heavily mediated, but this is ultimately due to positions in the global division or the constellations of old and new divisions of labor.
So that's about the effect. Sorry for being like a flag reminder.
Yeah, about the effect, you're right. I should perhaps deal with this one because that kind of relates to, yes, Florian's question was similarly about variegation and the effectiveness. Well, the effectiveness is a political question. This is where, you know, agency matters, and this is where things are contingent, things are open to, I mean, nothing in what I've described, of course, you know, because I was forced to perhaps emphasize the structural trait, but, and there are structural forces, of course, involved. I hope I've made this point clear. But all of this is also contingent on the range of struggles which develop around those impulses, right? So there could be political forces that, you know, try really hard to block some state capitalist impulses or to push them in some specific directions. And this leads to the question of politicization, right? So as we observe more and more of those state capitalist impulses, that creates political openings for various forms of repoliticization. For instance, when states, when central banks very clearly act in terms of supporting directly financial markets, for instance, by printing money out with quantitative easing and stuff, this creates an opportunity for politicizing this question. And then you see people who are pushing for, quantitative money for the people, greening central banks operation and all that kind of stuff. And so you have all of those political struggles that I absolutely did not do justice today, but which we think actually are fundamental to understand how those impulses develop. And yeah, and this is also related to the question of effectiveness. I mean, there's this is related to contingent factor, I would say. This is probably a not fully satisfying answer, but there's definitely, my point here is to emphasize the open-endedness of political struggles. And to Jeff, yes, entirely agree. I think you're right. We discussed a lot those impulses, and especially the more positive one, the productivist one, the stabilizing, and the absorptive one. And we wanted really hard to avoid the regulationist bent of emphasizing too much stability and the capacity of states to engineer modes of regulations that bring some stability to the system, which is fundamentally unstable. But I also do think that, in defense to the typology, that states are doing all sorts of things to preserve a modicum of that. So perhaps those impulses must be understood as always precarious and kind of unstable themselves, and as always politically contested and prone to failure. They fail all the time. And this is more of a process of failing forward than it is about providing coherent visions and long-term strategies and so on. And finally, about secular stagnation, entirely agree. It was a little bit for a strategic reason that I used here secular stagnation instead of say the more Brennerite thing about the long downturn, although I did mention this, or a more classic crisis of over accumulation and so on. But I entirely agree. I mean, my understanding is that we had this crisis of over accumulation, which has built up in the 60s, 70s, and which has led to a number of crises at this period of time. There's been a partial, mitigation of those over accumulation tendencies with a neoliberal response to that, with structural adjustment in the global south, the opening of China, the opening of the post-Soviet bloc, and so on, which has for a little bit provided a relief to those over accumulation tendencies. But then, of course, and which have opened the space for the transformations that I described, of reorganization of the labor process, of the new international division of labor, and so on. But then this in turn has massively expanded the scale of production and productivity level, which has fed even worse or worsened, the tendencies toward overproduction, market saturation, and stuff. And those have become very visible now. Yeah, I hope this explains a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it's a great start to trying to understand, and thanks Ilias and Adam to show us a little bit of the contradictions of the tools that can make us understand the contradiction of the current capitalism through the state capitalist lens. So thanks again. Thanks, Susan, for starting this very interesting debates, and thanks for the participants and the great questions. And as a reminder, this presentation, this talk will be available on the website for those who wants to watch it again and make notes, but also maybe ask questions to Ilias. And we look forward. When is the book coming up? Do you have a provisional date? Or?
No, not quite. I can't say, unfortunately. I mean, we're still finishing it. Some chapters are incomplete, and we don't have quite a contract finalized yet either, so I can't even give a date. I don't have it myself.
Okay, but yeah, well, let's see, like soon, hopefully. All right, so I'll see you around, and thanks again, Ilias. It has been really, really great. All my questions will be for maybe next conference when I see you. All right, bye. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and I'll see you again. Bye.
Thanks again.